Hi, I'm Melinda Parker, Assistant Director of Municipal Services and Operations with the City of Lawrence. And I'm going to talk today about alternative delivery, some of the policy changes we made last year, as well as the new procedures and new procurement methods we used on a police facility project. If you have any additional questions, you can reach me at my office number 785-832-7880. We're going to cover the policy change that it was a pretty big change for us last year in modifying our charter ordinance, and then using the new procedures that were developed and the new procurement, some new procurement methods that were unique that we had not used yet in the city. We use those for our police facility projects. So we recently contracted, we executed a contract in August with our architect for the police facility, and then we just executed the contract about a month ago with the construction manager. So I'll go over in detail, and so we'll talk a little bit about how this came about, a little history on the project, just because I'll tie back to the project and give some specific examples as we go through. So just so everyone's on the same page with the project, some basic information about it. The police facility, they started with a needs assessment back 2011-2012 that really identified the programming needs, the size of facility needed, and the cost for this project. So right now we have our police department spread over 4 or 5 different locations around town. They've never really had a facility designed for that function. So it's been something that's been needed for a while. In 2014, there was a sales tax vote, which failed. It was a narrow margin, but it failed. And so we listened and tried to regroup. What were we hearing from that? One was, of course, that the cost was too high at $28 million. One of the other items that we heard is that we were proposing to purchase property. And so the citizens, through lots of input at public meetings and through comments on website and things like that, they were letting us know that they thought we should use city-owned property. So really looked at all the city-owned property across the city. It had to be at least 13 acres. So we're looking at growth, kind of a campus feel over the course of 50 to 100 years. So they started looking at that, and they also didn't like that it was sales tax. They wanted it funded with property tax. The thought was that with sales tax, it was disproportionate to those with lower incomes. So they wanted to be sensitive to that. So the biggest priorities that came out of that in the spring of 2017, the governing body approved moving forward with a phased project, with phase 1 being $18.5 million. And they wanted to make sure that the project was really looking at all those future phases. So create a master plan, look at city-owned property, and we had a new city manager come on in March of 2016, and he had a background in alternative delivery. He really wanted to look at best value. So traditional delivery, design, bid, build, he had had some challenges with that on past projects, and so he was really pushing us to do best value, look at qualifications and cost. And so wanting to take care of all of these priorities, it really pointed in the direction of alternative delivery to get the contractor involved early. It offered the maximum flexibility in our design, getting costs early. We wanted all that cost information to stay within budget. So we started going down that path. One thing we noticed is that as we started discussing alternative delivery, there was some angst in the community. There were articles written in the paper and comments made about it's a no-bid process. If you don't do the traditional design, bid, build, it's just a free-for-all. You're playing favorites, and we're not getting the best value for the public dollar. So we started having meetings and educating the public and the governing body on the different types of alternative delivery, looking at what aspects we could write into our contract terms that made them feel more comfortable if we went that route. A lot of the things that we discussed, they were like, but how can we make sure you're going to do what you're saying you're going to do if we go alternative delivery? So that discussion took place, we actually had done alternative delivery in the past with our previous city manager, but whenever our new city manager started looking at our charter ordinance, he said, you really don't allow yourself the option to do that. So the governing body had said okay to a couple design build projects, 2006, 2007, for utilities, and then they had actually used construction manager at risk delivery method on our library renovation that was completed in 2014. But the city attorney's office and our city manager said, you know, we don't even specifically call out this in our charter ordinance, so we need to clean that up. If we move forward and we're setting procedures for how we're going to do this, we need to start at least with the charter ordinance that allows it. So, I'm not sure if everyone's familiar with what a charter ordinance is, but a charter ordinance is a required local ordinance. You have to adopt this local ordinance whenever it's in conflict with state law. So in the early 1900s, state statute outlined that you have to use sealed bid process, engineer's estimate on any capital improvement project that's over $2,000. So obviously we have updated that and made a change to that state law with the charter ordinance. Our last charter ordinance was in the 1980s, and then we had updated it since the 1980s, but only the amount. So we had changed that amount a couple different times over the last 100 years, and the latest aligned with our new purchasing policy that said anything over 50,000. It had to go through a formal, bid process, and if it was over 100,000, then the governing body had to approve it. If not, it could happen at the city manager level. But still, everything over 50,000 had to have an engineer's estimate. It had to have the formal bid. So we wanted to put some language in there that would allow alternative delivery. One of the issues with this is it's not just a vote of majority. We had to have 2/3 vote, which actually created an issue for us when we first approached this in December of 2017, because we had a commissioner it was his last meeting, and there was going to be a new commissioner coming in, so of course it got deferred. They wanted to wait until they had a full commission with all the new commissioners that would be leading this project. And the other issue with this that can delay the project is after the second reading, it has to get published in the paper, and then there's 60-day waiting period basically for protest until it becomes effective. So I got involved in September of 2017 after they already had the bond resolution for funding. They'd already approved a phased project, and we were thinking alternative delivery, and we actually didn't get to start proceeding until May of 2018 because of the process of getting the charter ordinance. So the other piece of that, this is the language that was finally approved to be added, this section of the charter ordinance. And so basically the part I've highlighted is that we could undertake a public improvement or construction with alternative delivery if the governing body finds it's in the public interest. So you actually have to approach them ahead of time and then make that determination that it's in the public interest. So how do we go about doing that? How do we consistently always show with a recommendation that it's in the public interest? And then they also wanted language in here about adopting set procedures so that it's consistent. And outside of this, they said they would not let this be effective until the procedures were approved. So they went ahead and did the first and second reading. Yes?
You say set procedures in terms of metrics to determine when you'll use alternative delivery, or set procedures on how you implement the alternative delivery once it's been approved?
Yes and yes. So it had to include the factors on how we recommend it, what did we consider when recommending it, and then it also included our selection evaluation process for alternative delivery, and then also how the project would be managed in terms of contract terms and all of that. So I'll go into the details of that. But one of the issues was we knew that the clock started basically in February after they did the second reading, and we had until the first week in May to come up with procedures and get them approved by the governing body. So sometimes it's hard for things to move that fast. But we were able to make that work. So did some research with the Center of Procurement Excellence. They had a lot of information out there on what's being done across the country and even internationally in terms of alternative delivery. And then the city worked with Dr. Brian Lyons with KU. They're part of the Simpler Institute, but they do research also in alternative delivery, and they've collected data on over 3,500 projects on something they call the expertise-driven project delivery. So it's what characteristics does a project have to be successful, and they ask owners, contractors, design consultants, and so they model this delivery method on that, and it's what do we need to do to draw out expertise when we're selecting firms. So the objectives of the procedures, as I mentioned, to identify the factors that you look at, to provide those guidelines for the process itself, and a lot of that played into we wanted to document what we had told the governing body we would do to make sure they felt comfortable that we were going to do it that way, and then also to have accountability and transparency during the project, because they were concerned that once we get their approval to do the project, they don't hear from us again until there's like a change order or something. So how do we give them updates? How are we transparent to the public? So these are some of the factors that were mentioned in the procedures. It was just some examples that we had discussed during meetings. This is not all-inclusive, and we say that in the procedures. I won't read through all of these, but some of the ones that we used for the police facility when we were recommending it is that it had project phasing considerations. So whenever you're looking at phasing, it helps to have contractor input early, which is also number 8. If we want to encourage innovation and the ideas of the design, having that contractor input is helpful because then they're also giving, constructability reviews, cost estimates, and all of that during the pre-construction period. And then one that I highlight here is public perception. So when we were looking at the options for the police facility in particular, we were looking at different forms of design build, and we were looking at construction manager at risk. Unfortunately, for some reason, I'm not sure if it was the articles that were written or just some comments in our local paper, but they were against design build, and that was the direction we were originally trying to go. So we had to meet in the middle. We felt meet in the middle with a construction manager at risk delivery method, because they still saw that we were contracting. We would have an agreement with both the design firm and the contractor. It would bring the contractor in early, but we could specify certain things that we wanted in terms of open book, bids by subcontractors and things like that. So when it came to the evaluation and selection process, we had 3 main steps. First, we identified how the selection committee would be picked. We mentioned that it had to be at least 3 people from the city, but then we'd be open to having others, interested stakeholders on that selection committee as well. And that would, of course, be presented to the governing body if we brought in anyone that was not city staff. They'd have to be trained in the procurement method, really understand the RFP going out, how we're going to be evaluating. They'd have to be trained in all of that. One of the things that was important to us is that when they're looking at written proposals, they're reviewing and scoring those independently, and it's not a consensus, a group, as they're doing the initial scoring. So everyone scores it individually, and then you come together and you can point out, well, why did you score them high, you score them low, let's talk about that. But that way you wouldn't have people swayed by maybe people that looked at it a little more closely, or someone didn't really take a look. We just didn't want any bias coming in, and that also leads to no conflicts of interest. So there's statements about how those on the selection committee would not have any bias or conflicts of interest with those that were proposing or with the project itself. And then the evaluation process, we identified that you could use an RFQ to narrow it down with the qualifications you want. But then there would be a competitive RFP, and then potentially shortlisting for interviews. So the competitive RFP, like most RFPs, identified you needed to have clear instructions, a schedule of the dates of when things are due, and your project timeline, requirements, deliverables, scope of work. Just wanted to make sure we covered all the bases so we didn't put out an RFP that was lacking some of the necessary information. And then we got into evaluation criteria, and we've kind of been all over the board with our RFPs. When we put them out, we'd say, oh, it's going to be judged on these things, but we wouldn't identify the percentage for all of these. It's going to be based on your qualifications and your project experience and who you submit. Well, it's pretty vague, so we made it very clear, and it was very numeric. Okay, this percentage is this component you're submitting, this percentage is that component. And then with this alternative delivery, they wanted to make sure that cost was always a factor, but we emphasized that it needed to be separate. Any cost, fees, financial information is separate. It's not looked at until everything else is done, so that, again, you're not swayed by the cost you receive. And that no one evaluation criterion would be weighted more than 35%. So again, that came from some of the research that we did. The ideal for cost was more in the 15-20% range, but overall they said, if the research showed that if you could keep any one criterion under 35%, then you're not going to sway it. If you don't have something like that in there, the governing body could say, we want cost 90%. Well, what's the point? That it's going to end up turning into a low bid. So all of that was written into the procedures in terms of the evaluation process. And then, of course, the highest scoring, we go through and after the written proposals, there could be the short list to the interviews, and then the cost would be factored in, and the highest scoring based on all of that, we would then start negotiations. If it wasn't successful, we would move on to the next highest scoring, and then we would also reserve the right that if something changed or we realized there was a bust in what deliverables we needed or the scope of work, we could scratch everything and issue a new RFP out, or we could also just choose to do away with the project if it came down to that. So we never want that, but we needed that out just in case. In terms of project management oversight, we identified that the project manager needs to be familiar with the type of project they're managing and also with the delivery method. So we didn't want to put someone, city staff-wise, in charge of a project if they've never been involved in a construction manager at risk or design build project, have them be our main contact. So they had certain qualifications. For scope management, it identified certain contract terms, which most standard AIA, EJCDC would have the language that, on a construction manager at risk, if you get to guarantee max price, you can't reach an agreement. There's always that out that you can choose to switch to a traditional bid environment at that point. So it was important to the governing body that the city had an out if we couldn't come to terms during any of our cost discussions. Quality controls, such as the project manager being involved from design through construction, was ideal. And when I say project manager, it's the city's project manager on our city staff side of things. And then how would scope changes be communicated to city management and to the governing body? In the cost management section of the procedures, we talked about tracking and reporting, how often on a project you would formally report on it, what things need to be tracked, so that it didn't turn into the governing body. Something was brought up during a public forum. They asked staff, well, where do we stand with this? And then it takes weeks to go dig up the information. So just having that consistent reporting all along the way. And then we put in here a section, it didn't require open book costing, but that if that on the project was something the governing body wanted, we would have that. And that would include basically anything could be open book to the city at any time, and it could require that we have public bids for subcontractors, for instance, or maybe we need to be able to see the top 3 that are selected on a construction manager type delivery method. So outline some different options there if they pushed that issue. On communication, it identified our project management system. We went through an implementation with eBuilder to be our software for managing projects. We just went through that last year. So this indicates what things would be in there. It's basically all of our document management, all correspondence. So during design, all plan review goes through this process for reviews across the city. When you get to construction, RFIs, your shop drawings, a lot of projects now are using some sort of online-based software. And we were noticing each project use something different. And I know it's not ideal for those not in the city, but for the city, we thought we would like to be consistent. Now, we're not going to ask contractors to use it for all their subs. They've got their own system. But as far as when we're working with an architect and a contractor, we want our correspondence to be in this system and all located in one place. And then the reviews of the vendor performance was something new. We wanted a formal way to evaluate the vendors that we worked with at the end of the project, and then have that available when they submit on a new project. How did the last one go? So numerical surveys, filling out what was good, what wasn't, comments and all of that, so that we would create that database of information and who worked on the project, that sort of thing. So when it came to the police facility, the governing body did approve construction manager at risk in May of 2018. We started using the new procedures, and we actually used them for the design consultant, even though we already had procedures on a qualifications-based system for professional services. And then we also contracted with KU to help us with some even more unique procurement that took it even beyond the procedures that we had identified. And I'll get into that, because it was really unique, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback on it. So this is the expertise-driven project delivery method that KU is working with the Simpler Institute. It's, I think, 6 different universities, and they're doing all this research. These are some things that were pretty unique that they do. So one is that the written proposals are blind, and instead of the city on this project receiving, binders from different firms with a bunch of nice pictures and marketing and business development information, and I used to be in consulting, so you put all that together and you're like, are they going to look at every word? Probably not. What's going to catch their attention? And they all say the same thing. Of course, if you're submitting, we're the best, we've done hundreds of projects, these are the ones we've done like yours, and they all say great things, but it's hard for someone evaluating it to see how do you distinguish between them? Who's really going to provide the expertise on this project? So this blind process, the reason we use KU is we don't have a procurement officer per se that would be able to take care of this for us in-house. Everything was submitted to KU, and they had a team of individuals that would make sure there was nothing, no logos, no names, no client names, no project names, or anything like that. And we would see 2 to 3 pages on execution. How do you plan to execute our project? And really highlight your expertise as for example, for the contractor, construction manager, how can you show, you will specifically do our project? And then 2 pages on risk assessment, on the controllable risk, and 2 pages on the non-controllable risk. So identify the risks you see with our project, and then how you're going to mitigate those risks. And so that really, we had 10 proposals submitted on the police facility project for the construction manager at risk. And it was very clear who had expertise and who didn't, or at least who knew how to communicate that to us in the written blind portions. And then value assessment, there was a wide range from identifying the expertise that maybe they have on their team to pointing out things that we could do in the design or in the construction that would add value to the project, but maybe with minimal cost. So the team ended up reviewing 9 or less pages for each of the 10 firms. And we really were able to look word for word and judge those and score them. So basically, on all 3 of these, you would score either anything from a 1 to a 10. 5 was, there was really no differentiation. You're kind of middle of the road. was good, decent, you know, you'd be fine, you'd be able to perform the project. A 10 was, it was outstanding, like this expertise, it was just so apparent you were way above everybody else. To a 1 is, I absolutely do not want to hire this firm, they scare me, you know, so there was the range. And you could use other, you know, you could give a 7 or an 8, but you needed to be able to justify, if you gave one a 7 and one an 8, well, why was this firm a point higher than that firm? If we're trying to distinguish expertise, we wanted those ranges. So we'd go through and we'd review them and put them into those piles, and then review them again. And, basically, each individual on the selection committee, they would look at each one like 3 different times, just to make sure we were scoring them correctly. And again, we did the scoring individually. The other thing that is unique about the expertise-driven project delivery method is that the key project team individuals that you're going to be working with, they're identified in the proposal, and ideally they're putting the proposal together. It's not just marketing and business development. They're involved in filling that out, but we interview them individually. So it's like a job interview. So like the little picture shows, we had a line of 7 individuals on one side and 1 person on the other side. And it was a job interview. And we went through and asked during those interviews questions about their execution, their risk, their value, specific to their role. So everyone we talked to had never experienced anything like that. We set up 30-minute interviews. For the construction manager, we interviewed the project manager, the pre-construction manager, and the site superintendent. So out of the 10 site superintendents, I don't think any of them had been in an interview like that before. And you know, we weren't scoring people based on how well they interviewed. It was the information that they were providing. And so you tried to loosen people up a little bit, as much as you can when you have 7 people staring at you. But when we ask these questions specific, you know, site superintendent, tell us about your typical day. What do you do first thing to the end of the day? How do you plan ahead? You know, those type of questions. So those that have a lot of experience, they would go through what was important to them. You know, some stressed safety a lot. Some stressed, oh, I'm looking ahead, not next week, I'm looking next month, and on and on. So that was just really unique. Normally you come in as a group, what we would see, and you give a presentation. But here it was like a job interview setup. The cost proposal was scored numerically. So again, we wouldn't see the cost until the very end. But the firm with the lowest cost got a full 35 points out of 100. And then it was a mathematical percentage of less points as you got higher in cost. So it was completely mathematical, numerical, you know, calculations on the cost. And then the pre-award clarification phase, that part of expertise-driven project delivery says that after we've selected and we enter negotiations, we take it a step further where we're all sitting down and we're going through the proposal and specifically the execution, risk, and value, like line by line. And you can also in the proposal submit some assumptions, and then we don't look at it until we get to this phase. But let's clarify before we start writing up any contracts. Let's clarify the scope. Let's work out, you know, if you had to make this assumption, was it a good assumption, was it not? How do we remedy that? What kind of risk did you bring up and how you would mitigate it? Let's talk through that. Many times it would say, okay, if we encounter rock, this is how we're going to deal with it. And so we identified action plans for every risk. And all of that's before the contract's signed, so you can write in line items for all these items you might run into. And so that was really, really helpful, I think, for both sides, so we're all on the same page. So these are some items, the following probably 10 slides or so, cutouts from our RFP for the police facility. So this is an example of how we identified the 100 points on that RFP. And we'll go through each one of these in detail. But the top 3 are the blind component. These next 2, the narratives and related experience, is really the firm's experience. They could give a description of a project and some colored images. And we wouldn't see that until they're shortlisted, and then we could use that during the interview to ask specific questions. And then the past performance surveys, it was only 5 points, but we needed those on each individual we were interviewing. They would send them to a past client, and they would score, like a survey, score up to 10, and then we would plug those points in, and it was numeric. So of course everyone submits surveys that are 9s and 10s. For that reason, it doesn't really distinguish expertise, but it does let us know what projects, what 3 projects do they feel are most relevant to ours. There's a spot where we could, reach out to those clients and ask how they felt things went with that individual. And so it provided us that information again ahead of the interviews.
Hey, Melinda.
Yeah.
You're going to hit this later in the presentation, then I'll just wait, but for the items on there, besides that narrative, which is pass-fail, and besides cost, for those other criteria, how much diversity have you seen in the answers, the evaluations? I mean, is it pretty consistent with most of your people on the panel, or did you see a lot of variation?
What KU did when they would plug everything into their spreadsheet is they would identify if you were off by more than 4 points. So if one evaluator gave a 1 and another evaluator gave a 10, they would highlight those things. And we didn't have very many of those through this blind portion here. Usually it was pretty consistent. You might have one outlier, and we had a diverse evaluation group. We had our transportation engineer, I was in there, we had 2 captains from PD, we had our assistant director of Parks and Rec, and we had an assistant city manager. So occasionally you would see maybe the Parks and Rec would rate things differently because they latched on to something they said about the park. So it was very specific to, that caught their attention, that mattered to them. For instance, if they mentioned safety, that was big for me. So I would tend to skew my ratings a little bit based on whether they mentioned safety or they didn't mention safety, and how they handle that. Some used up half a page of their 2 pages talking about safety. So that made a difference to me. And the city manager, assistant city manager, was looking for a different thing. So usually when it was off, it was because of what it was that stood out to them, and we would just talk through that. But it all ended up working out. When we would see the scores, and they would be classified contractor A, labeled contractor A, B, C, it was random, through contractor J, I think. And so then we would see, this was the scoring, and maybe a couple people would go, well, that one was maybe a little higher than that, but yeah, pretty much we're all in agreement. This is how they scored out. This was the ranking. And when it came down to it, we had our top 5, and they look at how much of a break point is. So there was a clear distinction between the top 2, and then the next set of 3, and then the next set of 5, basically. So we could either interview the top 2, and then there was like a 16% difference. Then if we wanted to interview more, we really should interview 5. So we chose to interview 5 instead, because mathematically there was a possibility they could still win. So we interviewed 5. But it was very clear, and those top 2 stayed the top 2 through interviews, just because of the individuals they had on the team, and you could tell how prepared they were. So there were 9 different proposal forms that were submitted. Again, these 3 made up 9 pages because the execution methodology, they submitted 2 pages, and then they could submit a 3rd page, which was a work breakdown schedule, the schedule for the project. And then for risk, it was up to 4 pages, 2 pages on non-controllable, 2 pages on controllable risk, and then value was 2 pages. So this is what we reviewed first. The signature form was just, the cover basically of contact info, and a signature saying, yes, I read the proposal and all the addenda, or the RFP and all the addendas. The project team is where they identified the individuals. We mentioned both of these, so I'll show you what those forms look like. The proposal assumptions, again, we didn't look at until we got to the very end. Now, KU did look at them to make sure there were no assumptions in the proposal that would throw off the costs. Because if someone said, well, we assumed, you were going to fence the perimeter site of the site, and someone else said, well, we excluded fencing, whatever, they made sure to make accommodations for that in the costs. And then the cost proposal itself. So we'll go through these pretty quick. It was pretty basic, where we identified, give us the name of the person and the name of the firm. Normally, it might be the same, right? But we did have a joint venture, so it identified the firm. And then whenever we did this for the design services, we asked for the site civil, the MEP, and so they listed the different firms that those individuals were with. This, as I mentioned, the blind component, and these are the things we're really looking for in the execution. How are they going to deliver the scope of work? So they talk about milestones, activities, deliverables, things that stood out to them that would be important based on our specific project. Maybe that a lot of them did research by going out to the site that had been selected. Some of them came into the interview knowing, well, you've already done some borings and could talk through with us, okay, do you know where rock is yet? Well, it's about 5 feet. Well, what does that mean? So the pre-construction manager were saying, okay, so if rock is 5 feet down and we're looking at doing a 2-story kind of walkout basement style, what does that mean? What's the cost per cubic yard if you run into rock? And so then they talk about, well, if it's diggable, we're looking at this. If it's not, those that could actually, based on their experience, just talk through those things, they were showing their expertise in that way. So, this was proposal form 6, and all of these, they would give like this heading at the top, and you could delete the instructions so that you had more space, but it was, keep the same text size and all of that. So this was their narratives, and then we allowed a page of pictures. The past performance surveys, this is what it would look like. So they would fill in what was highlighted in yellow with the information, then send it to their client. And then their client would score them 1 to 10, all these different questions. So basically rate their quality of work, rate their ability to manage project costs or manage the schedule. So that's what we were looking for. And then at the bottom, they could give specific comments about the individual and the firm. And then this was page 1 of the cost proposal. Page 2 was actually a detailed table or matrix for general conditions. But what we were looking for on the cost was the pre-construction fee, then we looked at the construction phase services fee in terms of a percentage, and then the not to exceed general conditions cost, and so that was the total at the bottom of page 2 that they would put here. And so we gave them some assumptions, assume a 12-month construction schedule, and then there were unit costs and then the total not to exceed. So this got attached, with the firm we selected, this got attached to the agreement. And we know, even though we only issued this first phase of the agreement with them for pre-construction and that pre-construction fee, we already know what if we locked in with our general conditions. And we were able to go through and make sure we were all on the same page with those general conditions, which we were. KU looked at different ways. When it comes to cost, you can play games a little bit, what's my advantage, what do I weight heavier or not. Basically, the percentage, we took it percentage times our construction, what we think our guaranteed max price is going to be around 16 million. And so we took whatever percentage of the 16 million and had a fee. We added it to the pre-construction fee, and we decided this ahead of time. This is how we would formulate it because we looked at all these different options. That would be 50%. So sum those two together, that's 50% of the 35 points. So 17.5. If you were the lowest on those two added together, you got the full 17.5 points because that's half the 35. And then number 3 down here, the not to exceed general conditions cost, that was the much larger number. And so that one would go in and whoever had the lowest would get 17.5 points for that. So it's kind of hard to talk through, but hopefully everyone followed that. But if we had summed them all together, it didn't make a difference in the short list. KU verified that. Like, it didn't matter how you added it up, the top 5 are still the top 5. And it didn't matter whenever you looked at who was awarded the project. It would have made a difference on, second, third, well, not second, third, fourth, fifth. They kind of rearranged a little, depending on how you did this. That's why we had to decide it up front. We didn't want to be making those decisions after the cost came in. So some of the objectives of the expertise-driven procurement and the reason we used it, KU goes through and they do a training and they tout this, but for the owner, it enhances project performance so you can really get those greatest qualifications, the most expertise. And you're learning through this process too. Like we saw 10 different approaches to our project. So even though we selected one firm based on their expertise, we could talk through approach or risks that were identified by others. And is there something that this other firm mentioned that, I mean, it's to our advantage to know that, so we were able to leverage that a little bit, just that knowledge and experience we were learning through the process. The other advantage is to become a client of choice. So if we, and this is their term, so I put in quotes, if we continue to use this method and it eliminates, when you're going through and doing that clarification, it eliminates a lot of, I guess, disagreement during construction. You have fewer change orders. It just gets everybody on the same page. Everyone's working as a team. We're reasonable. We're wanting to pay on time. We're wanting, you know, it makes contractors and design consultants want to work with us because we're doing something fair and transparent. It's clear. And so that's an advantage to us because then there's more competition on our projects, but also, I mean, everyone wants to be in that position where you're working with folks that you feel are professional and have the expertise. So on the vendor aspect, they're able to really outline their approach that they want to use in the project from the very beginning and go through and clarify things before the agreements are signed. They can identify their risks and their solutions, again, from the very beginning, and if something doesn't line up with what the owner thinks, you can talk through that before you sign a contract. You can confirm action items. So if you've made assumptions on what the owner's going to provide, you can confirm that, what resources will be available. We outline in that pre-award clarification, these are the items that the owner has to submit. You know, whether we were getting the site survey done, whatever the dates are and the expectations that the owner has on them, we write those into that document that gets attached to the agreement. So we're also held accountable for that. It's like if we don't review this in a 2-week time period, this is the outcome. We talk through all those things ahead of time. And for the vendor, it allows them to be more efficient, so maximize profit. So now I can open it up for any questions. Thanks for bearing with me through policies and procedures. I don't have, normally when I give presentations, it's about projects, and I have cool construction, time lapses, and video, and cool pictures, and this, I was like, it's a lot of words, so thanks for bearing with me. Yeah.
So the work that KU did in helping sort through the presentations and distill it down for your staff, is that something they're going to be doing on an ongoing basis for the City of Lawrence, or is that a one-time thing while you hire some personnel that could take that over internally? Or?
Well, the thought was whenever they put together the first proposal for doing this work for us, and they said they would do 3 to 5 projects and basically train our staff, all of our project managers on how to do this, and eventually hand it off. So it's as much us learning how to do this on our own. They don't want to be in the business of doing this, but they like the research, so it's like this partnership. It was very inexpensive to have them run it, so that was nice. They have a lot of grad students doing the work, you know, so we probably wouldn't consult out to have others do this. It was just very reasonable within our budget. We were able to learn through it. And then the hope is that we would find someone in-house, but there's occasionally we might have to go outside if it's a high-profile project and people really think that city staff might be biased no matter what we tell them. We might have to do that. But what we're hoping is that someone in finance eventually could be that person, that procurement officer that just looks through if we want to do a blind evaluation. It's really that piece, who's going to collect it and decipher everything if we want to have it blind. Otherwise, you know, we can have it submitted, have costs separate from the proposal, and that's fine. It's the blind component that makes it the trickiest. plugging the numbers into the spreadsheet are pretty easy. I could do it, but then they might say, oh, you're biased. You talk to your staff, so. So the hope is that we'll have someone there in that role in our, on our staff or in another department.
Thank you.
Correct me if I misheard, but the KU research that we were talking about at the front end said that kind of the sweet spot for the evaluation points for the cost was 15 to 20%.
Mm-hmm.
On the police facility, you went up to the city's maximum of 35. What drove that decision for that project?
This is the first project with the new procedures, and the community had voiced their opposition to alternative delivery and what they considered no bid process. They kept talking about how the city's considering not doing bids for the police facility. It was more their way of like putting a toe in and seeing how it goes. In the end, it was close. Our top two was very close, like within a point of each other. So cost did make the difference in the end. We did not go so far as to say if it had only been 20% would the second ranked, been up there. But yeah, that's what we're going to recommend in the future is that we stick with that 15 to 20%. So we're just going to continue to gather research on that.
No, no question.
I've got another question. Oh, go ahead.
Mine's two-part. First of all, it's been awarded, or the project's been awarded to a CM.
Yes, in December we awarded it to the construction
Okay,
manager.
so what was the feedback on the winning team on your process?
Actually, we debriefed with 8 of the 10 teams. We offered a debrief at the end,
That's good.
and we don't show them the spreadsheet breakdown of cost, but we, I should have brought an example. Oh, actually, I think I did. I don't have any way of projecting it. So basically, we identified with them during the debrief, we would show them a spreadsheet that basically highlighted these top 5, as well as the interview broken down by individual. And we would say, okay, this was your score, the raw score out of, the 1 to 10. Then this is it normalized because some of them, to 15 points. So if the raw score was 8.3, that was the average of everyone on risk, for instance. Then we'd say, okay, you had an 8.3 and you were the highest. 8.3 was the highest score. So then down here, you got 15 out of 15 points. So we'd show them the raw score, and then we showed them how that equated to the scores here. We did that for each thing, so they could see maybe where they were lower, because right next to it, it had what was the average of the shortlisted and the average of everybody. So they were, and then we would highlight if they were the top, the highest, just so that stood out in color, like this area was real strong. We gave them a breakdown with all the comments summarized from the interview, all the comments summarized from the written proposals. So if several evaluators made a similar comment, we'd kind of condense it, but they got to see all the comments that were provided. We told them how they ranked at each one of these. You were 3rd here, 2nd here, 4th there. And then when it came to cost, we would just tell them whether they were at the upper end, the lower end, or kind of middle of the range. But we didn't display that. There was some pushback on that. They wanted to see the costs, and I said, well, the only one that is out there is the one we awarded. I told them where they could find it. Like, it's public information. It was on our city agenda. It's part of the agreement that was signed. It's attached if you want to see who won. The one that won was middle of the road with costs. But that's where we left that. But the feedback we got was that it's a more detailed debrief than they had ever received before. They really liked the process where it focused on expertise. They said, we put more effort into this learning the project, but we put a way less effort in actually putting a proposal together. It was much more efficient, and they felt they were ahead of the game. If they were going to win it, they would be ready to just start off and on running on it because they already knew all the background. So it was positive even from those that scored, didn't get an interview. They even liked just the blind proposal portion, but those that interviewed really liked that method, and they said this is so unique. We've never done anything like this. Oh, sorry.
It's an interesting process. There's an old phrase that says garbage in, garbage out. So how did you clarify up front what it is you wanted in a project? what were the assumptions you gave each of the bidders? So they're all working off the same,
Our RFP was about 40 pages long. It had about 3 or 4 pages that detailed the deliverables we wanted, the background on the project, all of that. The rest of it was just references on how they could fill out this process since it's so new. And then we actually, at our pre-proposal meeting, we offered at the end of that, that was about an hour and a half where we would talk about the project, we offered another hour and a half long training with Dr. Limes on here's examples of, and everyone attended that, but here's some examples of a poorly written execution method, and here's a good example. Here's a poorly written risk, and here's a good example. And so he gave them a lot of pointers on, you know, this is how you can highlight your expertise. Here's examples from all different, I mean, they do this from technology projects to renovation projects. He pulled up a little of everything, and he even had a workshop at the end where you could go through and work in teams and try it out. So gave lots of examples. I think he had like 200 slides. And then we provided that as an addendum to it as well, so they could go back and reference that, all the slides.
This is, your presentation was pretty much focused on the procurement of the construction manager. Did the city's process for procurement of the design services change as a part of that overall
We
process?
didn't have
Did you
to.
did?
For alternative delivery, because we're going construction manager at risk, we could have just done, you know, what we normally do for procuring the design firm. Of course, it would have been different had it been a design build, but we actually chose to use KU and do this exact same thing with the design consultant because we wanted to emphasize the expertise in both components of that. And then we had the design architect that had been selected sit in on the interviews. And they were not a scoring member, but they were able to ask some questions. And basically they sat back and listened to our feedback and then would chime in occasionally. But that was beneficial too. And so the architect said that that was interesting to be on the other side of the table. And he goes, wow, it really is clear. Like you can tell who's researched it. Because there would be folks that came into the interview and they're like, I haven't really seen the proposal. No, we only got one of those. But we were told in the training that that happens. Do not do that. And there was someone who came in and said, I didn't see the proposal yet. Or I didn't work on the proposal. I just reviewed it like in the last day or so. So that was pretty telling. I was like, you get points for honesty, but you know, like you can't talk through the risks that were in the proposal because you didn't prepare them. But it was real obvious.
So was your scoring matrix on the design side the same matrix?
No, it was different. Typically, qualification-based selection, we don't have costs in there. We chose to do this and we made costs 10%. So we did want to see ahead of time what we were looking at in the range, and all the costs were really close. We had 4 proposals received on that. And the top 2, it was a clear distinction between the top 2 and the bottom 2, so we just interviewed the top 2 firms, and we would have been happy with either, but one did come, you know, 5-6 points ahead of the other one. So it was not quite as close of a range, but most of it was similar. We had, I think, 35% on interview, and we gave them some points on their narrative. I think that was maybe 5%. So basically take some of the cost and distribute among the others is where we were at with that. Yes.
Are you going to use this method for smaller construction cost projects, or is there a limit?
It takes more time, it does, but we've used variations of it, doing it in-house on smaller projects where we are still sticking with some of those procedures, and we're writing project management guidelines that identify some of these best practices. Even though it's not an alternative delivery project, let's still do this. But definitely not the blind portion on a smaller project. But some of the initiatives like keeping the costs separate, I mean, that, to me, that seems like common sense, right? If you ask them to submit costs, don't let that sway your decision. So keep that a separate sealed envelope until you're done. So some of those best practices we're using even on the smaller projects.